Nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills, Nicole Richie and Joel Madden's sprawling home was the envy of many, a perfect mix of modern elegance and historic charm. Built in the 1920s, the Spanish-style estate had seen its share of Hollywood glamour. Yet, behind its beautifully manicured hedges and sparkling fountains, a sinister story was beginning to unfold. Started small. Nicole first noticed the doors. At odd times, she'd find them open, doors she was sure she had closed. The French doors leading to the garden would be ajar in the morning, letting in the chilly air. At first, she brushed it off, blaming her two kids or even the wind. But when she locked those same doors one night and found them wide open again at sunrise, she began to feel a prickle of unease. Joel was skeptical. Old house quirks, he muttered when she mentioned it over dinner. He was more concerned about album deadlines than creaky doors. But then came the voices. It was Nicole who first heard them, soft whispers coming from the empty guest bedroom late at night. She thought it was the baby monitor picking up interference until the whispers grew louder, clearer. A woman's voice, mournful and melodic, sang a lullaby Nicole didn't recognize. Joel heard it too 2 nights later. He was in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when the same voice drifted through the air, sending chills down his spine. "Nicole," he called out, but she was fast asleep upstairs. That's when the smell began. Sweet, cloying, and unmistakable jasmine. It would fill a room without warning, lingering for minutes before vanishing. The couple didn't own jasmine-scented candles or perfumes, yet the smell would appear in strange places. The children's playroom, the basement, and once, disturbingly, in their bedroom as they lay in bed. Nicole started to feel watched even during the day. The sunny, open-plan kitchen suddenly felt oppressive, like unseen eyes were following her every move. The children complained of bad dreams. Their youngest, Sparrow, told her one morning, "The flower lady doesn't like it when I run too fast." Nicole froze. "What flower lady?" "The one with the big black hat," Sparrow said casually, munching his cereal. The final straw came during a dinner party. Close friends had gathered in their candlelit dining room, laughing and sipping wine, when one of the guests, a producer named Lisa, suddenly went pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Joel asked, the room falling silent. Lisa pointed to the corner of the room, where an antique mirror hung on the wall. "A woman," she whispered. "She's crying. Right there." No one else saw anything, but the mood soured instantly. The laughter was gone, replaced by a heavy tension that made even Joel admit something was wrong. The next morning, Nicole called a local historian who specialized in Los Angeles properties. What they uncovered chilled her to the core. The house had once belonged to a widow named Eleanor Green, a reclusive woman who was known for her love of jasmine flowers. She had lost her husband and infant daughter in a car accident in the 1940s and was said to have gone mad with grief. Eleanor lived alone in the house until the day she died by suicide, in the guest bedroom. Nicole couldn't bring herself to go back into that room. One night, just after 3 a.m., Joel woke to a sound that made his blood run cold. A faint, rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. He turned his head toward the bedroom window, expecting to see a tree branch swaying in the wind, but there was nothing outside. The tapping continued, closer now, echoing from the mirror across the room. Joel got up and approached the mirror cautiously. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned in closer. And then he saw it. A woman's face, gaunt and pale, her dark eyes staring straight through him. A black hat perched on her head, and just below her collar, a string of jasmine flowers hung like a noose. He stumbled back, crashing into the bedside table and waking Nicole, who screamed when she saw the terror on his face. They left the house the next day. To this day, the Madden Richie estate sits quietly in Beverly Hills, its elegant facade betraying no signs of its haunted past. But those who have lived there will tell you otherwise. The jasmine still blooms where it shouldn't, the doors still open in the dead of night, and sometimes, just sometimes, a soft lullaby drifts through the air, a song for a child long gone but never forgotten. The couple moved into a luxury rental a few miles away, leaving the house locked and unoccupied. But the terror didn't end. Nicole began having vivid dreams, or what she convinced herself were dreams of Eleanor Green. In these nocturnal visions, Nicole would find herself back in the house, wandering its darkened halls. The air always smelled faintly of jasmine, and the floor creaked beneath her bare feet. Somewhere in the distance, Eleanor's mournful voice would echo, calling out a name Nicole couldn't quite make out. One morning, after a particularly unsettling dream, Nicole woke to find a small jasmine flower on her pillow. She hadn't seen jasmine since they left the house. Joel dismissed it as a coincidence, but Nicole couldn't shake the feeling that whatever haunted their home hadn't let them go. Then the calls began. At first, they were nothing out of the ordinary hang-ups, wrong numbers. But one night, after the kids had gone to bed, Nicole answered a call from an unknown number. A faint crackling noise filled the line, followed by the same soft, melodic voice she had heard in the house. "Why did you leave?" Nicole dropped the phone as if it had burned her, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the rest of the room. Joel, hearing the commotion, rushed in to find her pale and trembling. She couldn't bring herself to explain, but Eleanor wasn't done. A week later, Joel returned to their rental after a late recording session to find every faucet in the house running full blast. The kids were asleep, and Nicole swore she hadn't touched them. The smell of jasmine was overwhelming, clinging to the air like a fog. That same night, Sparrow woke screaming, clutching his tiny chest. "She's here," he sobbed, pointing to the corner of the room. "She's mad at us." Nicole followed his gaze, but the corner was empty, at least to her. Joel, however, swore he saw the faint outline of a shadow retreating through the door. Desperate for answers, Nicole reached out to Eleanor Green's remaining relatives. Most of them had passed away or refused to speak about the house, but one elderly niece named Margaret finally agreed to meet her. Over tea at a nondescript cafe, Margaret recounted the story her family had long kept hidden. "Eleanor loved that house," she said, her voice heavy with age, "but it loved her back in the worst way. She used to say she could feel it breathing like it was alive. After her husband and baby died, she thought the house was the only thing that cared for her anymore." Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. But she wasn't alone. Eleanor always said there was something in the house, a spirit, or maybe something darker. She used to call it the keeper. "The keeper?" Nicole echoed, her skin crawling. Margaret nodded. "It wasn't just a ghost," she said. "It didn't just haunt the house, it owned it. And anyone who lived there was part of it, whether they liked it or not." Eleanor believed it wouldn't let her leave, even in death. Nicole's throat tightened. "Do you think it's true?" Margaret stared at her for a long moment before answering. "Do you?" That night, Nicole and Joel agreed they had to do something, anything to sever their connection to the house. But as they began researching paranormal experts and cleansing rituals, they realized something chilling. Their old house was no longer on the market. It hadn't been sold. And yet, someone or something had moved back in. Lights now flickered in the windows at night. The garden was being meticulously maintained. And every so often, Nicole thought she saw a figure in the upstairs window watching them. Joel decided to drive past one evening, against Nicole's protests, to see who or what was inside. As he pulled up to the curb, he felt a sudden, crushing weight in his chest, like the air had been sucked out of the car. The smell of jasmine filled the vehicle, stronger than ever before, and a single whisper crept into his ear, clear as day. "You'll come back." Joel slammed the car into reverse and sped home, his hands shaking on the wheel. But when he arrived, he found the front door to their rental standing wide open. Inside, Nicole stood frozen in the hallway, clutching her phone. "It's her," she said, her voice trembling. Joel followed her gaze to the screen, where a single message had appeared. "Come home. The keeper is waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Joel and Nicole tried to move on, burying the memories of the house under layers of daily life. They never went back, but someone else did. The house was sold 6 months later to a tech entrepreneur, David Harlow, and his wife, Elena, a lifestyle blogger with a penchant for restoring vintage properties. The couple had no idea about the house's past. To them, It was a dream come true, a historic gem in Beverly Hills with sprawling gardens and enough space for their twin daughters. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Elena documented their renovation journey on her blog, posting cheery updates about restoring the original wood beams and sourcing antique fixtures. David threw himself into work, barely noticing that Elena had stopped sleeping through the night. It began with the jasmine. Elena would walk into a room and catch the scent, faint at first but growing stronger with each passing day. She searched for its source, thinking perhaps the gardeners had planted something new, but there were no jasmine bushes on the property. Then came the shadows. Elena often worked late, editing photos in the dim glow of her laptop in the home office. Out of the corner of her eye, she started seeing movement, a flicker of darkness just beyond her line of sight. First, she thought it was exhaustion. But one night, as she turned her head toward the door, she saw it clearly. A woman, standing in the hallway, wearing a black hat. Elena gasped and turned on the lights, but the hallway was empty. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. When she told David, he laughed it off. "You've been watching too many horror movies," he said, brushing a kiss on her forehead. But Elena wasn't imagining things. Their daughters, Lila and Grace, began whispering about the flower lady during breakfast. Lila, the more timid of the two, refused to go to bed without the lights on. Grace, braver but unervingly serious for a 7-year-old, told Elena one morning, "She doesn't like Daddy." "Who?" Elena asked, her stomach nodding. "The flower lady," Grace said simply. David dismissed it as childish imagination until the night he heard the voice. He had been working late in his home office, the same space where Elena had seen the figure. The air was still and heavy, and the faint hum of his computer fan was the only sound. Then, out of nowhere, he heard it, a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, singing a melody that sent a shiver down his spine. He froze, the hair on his arms standing on end. The singing was faint, almost inaudible, but it was undeniably real. "Elena?" he called out, but there was no response. The voice faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving David questioning his sanity. But the house wasn't done with him. A week later, during a dinner party, the power went out without warning. Candles were lit, and laughter broke the tension. But as Elena went to retrieve more wine from the kitchen, she stopped in her tracks. The antique mirror above the dining room console had begun to fog over, as though someone were breathing on it. "Elena, are you okay?" a guest asked, breaking her trance. She pointed a shaking finger toward the mirror. The guests crowded around, their chatter silencing as they all saw the same thing. In the condensation on the glass, a single word had been written, slowly fading as they watched. "Leave." The mood of the evening soured, and guests made excuses to leave early. David tried to laugh it off as a prank, but his forced cheer couldn't hide his growing unease. That night, as they lay in bed, Elena whispered, "David, we can't stay here." David sighed. "It's just stress. The renovations, work, we're letting this house get to us." But Elena's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I don't think the house wants us here." David didn't respond. He couldn't. He had seen something earlier that he hadn't told her about, something that made his blood run cold. As he walked up the stairs to bed that night, he had glanced toward the guest bedroom, its door slightly ajar. There, standing in the center of the room, was the figure of a woman. She wasn't translucent or ghostly, she looked solid, real. Her black hat cast a shadow over her face, but her head slowly turned toward him. He blinked, and she was gone. But he could still smell the jasmine. The next day, Elena found something buried in the garden, a small, rusted locket with an inscription that read, "Eleanor." Inside was a faded black and white photograph of a woman holding a baby. She showed it to David, her hands trembling. "I think she's still here," Elena said. And that night, for the first time, David finally believed her. David decided to dig deeper into the history of the house, convinced there had to be a rational explanation. Late one night, after Elena and the girls had gone to bed, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down at his computer. Hours passed as he sifted through old property records, faded photographs, and cryptic articles buried in archives. It wasn't until nearly 3 a.m. that he found it, a grainy black and white image of a woman standing on the very steps of their home. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face partially obscured by the wide brim of a black hat. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Eleanor Green, last known resident of the home, circa 1946. Deceased." David leaned back, the air in the room suddenly feeling thick and heavy. He didn't realize he wasn't alone until the faint sound of humming filled the room. He froze, his pulse quickening. The melody was soft, distant, but unmistakable, the same song he had heard before. It was coming from somewhere behind him. Slowly, he turned his head toward the antique mirror hanging on the wall. At first, he saw only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. But then, behind him, another figure appeared, the woman in the black hat. Her face was clearer now, her hollow eyes locked onto his in the reflection. Before David could move, her lips parted, and a raspy whisper filled the room. "You don't belong here." He bolted from the room, his chair toppling over as he ran up the stairs. By the time he reached the bedroom, he was out of breath, his mind racing. Elena stirred awake, alarmed by his pale face and trembling hands. "What happened?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. David didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed her hand and said, "We're leaving. Tomorrow." But the house wasn't going to let them go so easily. The next morning, as they packed hurriedly, a loud crash echoed through the house. David rushed downstairs to find the dining room mirror shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor, and scrawled in the dust on the table beneath it were the words, "You can't run." Elena began crying, clutching their daughters close as David called the movers, demanding they come immediately. Hours later, as the family piled into their SUV, David glanced back at the house one last time. For a moment, everything seemed still, too still. Then, in the upstairs window, he saw the silhouette of a woman. She stood motionless, her black hat casting a shadow over her face, and in her hand, she held the rusted locket Elena had found in the garden. The family drove away, their tires kicking up gravel as the house faded into the distance. But that night, as they stayed in a nearby hotel, the jasmine returned. It started faintly in the corner of the room, growing stronger until it filled the air. Elena woke first, her heart pounding as she shook David awake. "The girls," she whispered. "Check the girls." David threw the covers off and ran to the adjoining room where the twins slept. The door creaked open, revealing the two beds. Grace was sound asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. But Lila's bed was empty, and on the pillow, where her head had rested just hours before, lay a single jasmine flower. From somewhere deep in the silence of the night, the melody of a lullaby drifted through the air. David's heart nearly stopped as he stared at the empty bed. He turned frantically, calling for Lila, his voice cracking with panic. Elena rushed in behind him, her face pale as she saw the flower on the pillow. "She's here," Elena whispered, trembling. "She took her." "No," David said, shaking his head. "We're not doing this. Lila's here, she has to be." The jasmine smell grew stronger, clinging to the air like smoke. David and Elena searched the room, calling Lila's name, but the child was nowhere to be found. David grabbed his phone to call 911, but the screen wouldn't respond. It was frozen, the display flickering faintly. And then, from the direction of their hotel room closet, came the soft sound of humming. David and Elena locked eyes, their breath caught in their throats. Slowly, David approached the closet door, his shaking hand reaching for the knob. "Lila," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The door creaked open, revealing darkness inside. For a moment it seemed empty, but then, in the corner he saw her. Lila sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, her head resting on her arms. Her tiny frame trembled as she hummed a melody that David and Elena recognized immediately. It was the same song, Eleanor's song. "Lila!" Elena cried, rushing forward to scoop her daughter into her arms. But as soon as Elena touched her, Lila's head snapped up, and her eyes. They weren't her eyes. They were hollow, dark voids, staring straight through Elena. A chilling smile spread across her face as a voice far older than Lila's emerged from her small mouth. "You didn't listen," the voice said, cold and detached. "You belong to me now." Elena stumbled backward, clutching her chest as David grabbed Lila, shaking her gently. "Lila, wake up. It's Daddy. Come back to us." Lila blinked, and for a fleeting moment, her normal eyes returned. "Daddy?" she whimpered, her voice small and frightened. "It's okay, baby," David said, holding her close. "We've got you." But then, the air in the room shifted. The smell of jasmine became overpowering, almost suffocating, and the lights flickered wildly. From behind them, the closet door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Lila screamed, clinging to David. "She's here. She's here." The humming returned, louder now, reverberating through the room. The melody twisted, dissonant and wrong, until it was no longer a lullaby but a sinister chant. The family huddled together, their fear palpable, as the room grew colder and darker. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. And then a voice spoke, low and commanding, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You can't escape me." The room exploded with chaos. Furniture toppled, the walls trembled, and the windows shattered inward, spraying glass across the floor. David grabbed Lila, pulling her toward the door as Elena scooped up Grace, who was now awake and sobbing hysterically. They ran from the hotel room, down the hall, and out into the parking lot, not stopping until they were all in the car. David started the engine, his hands shaking, and sped away, not caring where they were going. As the hotel disappeared in the rearview mirror, Elena turned to look at the girls in the back seat. Grace was crying softly, but Lila sat eerily still, her face pale, her hands clutching the stuffed rabbit she hadn't had in weeks. "How did she get that?" Elena whispered, her voice trembling. David glanced in the rearview mirror, his stomach twisting into knots. And then Lila spoke, her voice flat and emotionless. "She's not done yet." The car filled with the smell of jasmine. And from somewhere in the shadows of the night, the humming began again. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.